Before there was the United States of America, there was the British colony of North America. It was a lot different, but it's where our story begins. So let's go back to the beginning. Hello, and welcome to my channel. The history of the United States of America is a long one, and I want to start at the very beginning. But when it comes to history that goes back hundreds of years, there are always multiple ways to begin. Some people might say the first European country to lay claim to North America was Spain. Others might point to the French explorer Samuel de Champlain, who first explored the Great Lakes region in 1615, but for the purpose of this series, our story begins in 1763 with the end of the French and Indian War and the British victory that led to the acquisition of vast amounts of new land. After years of fighting between the British and French colonies and their respective Native American allies, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763. With the treaty, France ceded all of its territories in North America to Britain except for the small area around New Orleans. With this acquisition, Britain now controlled most of the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, an area that would encompass 13 separate colonies. And while the British had technically possessed these lands for decades, this moment marked the beginning of their rule over what would become the United States of America. Now at this time, the British Empire was a massive sprawling web of colonies and territories across the globe. While many people think of the American colonies as being rather isolated, they were actually quite integrated into the wider British system. They regularly traded with other British colonies in the Caribbean and Europe. And because the Atlantic Ocean wasn't exactly a peaceful place to traverse, many colonial governors and merchants shipped their goods via Britain. In fact, almost every good imported to the American colonies went through Britain first. This relationship would be extremely important in the years leading up to the American Revolution because it meant that colonists were deeply reliant upon the British for trade. In addition to this economic reliance, the British also provided the American colonies with a strong sense of security. Because of their numerous conflicts with the French, Spanish, and Dutch, Britain had established a large military presence throughout their empire. This included for strategically placed forts within the North American colonies that were occupied by British troops. As we will see later, the presence of these garrisons would help contribute to the tensions that eventually boiled over into war. But not everyone was happy about British rule. In fact, as the 18th century wore on, the relationship between the colonies and Britain would gradually deteriorate. And so to understand how we got to the American Revolution, let's take a look at some of the social, political, and economic factors that helped set the stage for independence. One of the most significant factors leading up to the American Revolution was the increasing power of the colonial assemblies. Over the course of the 17th and early 18th centuries, the various colonies had established representative assemblies which allowed colonists to participate in local governance. This was especially true in the New England colonies, where town hall meetings were a common way for citizens to have a direct say in government. In contrast to this trend, however, was the middle ground colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, which were dominated by wealthy landowners who often opposed colonial representation. They feared that, if power was given to the masses, it could lead to instability and ruin the prosperity of the colonies. Nevertheless, the idea of colonial representation continued to grow, and by the mid-18th century, it was becoming an increasingly popular sentiment throughout the colonies. However, this desire for representation was largely ignored by the British until the French and Indian War. You see, before the French and Indian War, the British colonies were largely left alone to govern themselves. But after the war, the British began to assert greater control over the colonies. The main reason for this was that the French and Indian War had been incredibly expensive, and the British government was eager to recoup some of their costs. To do this, they began to pass a series of new laws which greatly increased taxes on the colonies. Now, it's important to remember that at this time, the colonists didn't really pay any taxes directly to the British government. The only taxes they really had to worry about were those imposed by their local colonial assembly. However, that was all about to change. One of the first major acts passed by Parliament was the Sugar Act of 1764, which aimed to raise revenue by taxing sugar and molasses imported to the colonies. Then in 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which levied a tax on all printed materials in the colonies, including newspapers, pamphlets, and legal documents. Now, The British government argued that these taxes were necessary to pay off the debts incurred during the French and Indian War, but the colonists saw it differently. They argued that since they weren't represented in Parliament, they shouldn't have to pay these taxes. After all, how could a government tax people without their consent? This sentiment was echoed in the famous slogan of the time, "No taxation without representation." Now, while the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act caused a great deal of anger among the colonists, the next tax to hit would be the final straw. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which placed taxes on goods such as glass, tea, lead, and paint. What made the Townshend Acts particularly galling to the colonists was that the money raised from the taxes would go directly to the salaries of British officials in America, thus enriching the very people who were oppressing them. This led to a widespread boycott of British goods in the colonies, which caused the British to retaliate with even more force. In 1770, British soldiers fired on a crowd of Boston protesters, killing 5 and further inflaming tensions. Then in 1773, when colonial agents attempted to buy tea from British merchants to protest the Tea Act, the British East India Company responded by sending 3 ships full of tea to the port of Boston. In response to this, members of the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans and boarded the ships, dumping 90,000 pounds of tea into the ocean. When word of this act reached the British government, they responded with the Coercive Acts, which were designed to punish the colony of Massachusetts in particular. These acts closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea, limited town hall meetings in Massachusetts, and allowed British officials to be tried in other colonies or in Britain itself. While these acts were intended to punish Massachusetts, they actually had the opposite effect. They galvanized the other colonies to come to the defense of Massachusetts. This growing unity among the colonies would prove crucial in the years leading up to the Revolution. With the British government increasingly cracking down on the colonies, it became clear to many that something had to be done. A series of colonial congresses were held in the mid-1770s to discuss the best course of action. And while many delegates advocated for reconciliation with Britain, others argued that independence was the only viable option. Among the most ardent supporters of independence was Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that the British government was a den of thieves and that it was the duty of the colonists to throw off their tyrannical government. As the situation grew more heated, it fell to the Second Continental Congress to make a decision about how to proceed. After much debate, they voted to raise a colonial army and navy, as well as to send a delegation to Britain to ask for peace negotiations. Unfortunately for the colonists, the British weren't interested in negotiating, and soon after the request was sent, hostilities broke out. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched from Boston to the town of Lexington to arrest 2 men who had helped to fire on British soldiers. When the troops arrived in Lexington, however, they were met by a small group of colonial militiamen. The result was the first battle of the American Revolution. And so, my friends, we've come to the end of our brief history of the United States of America before it was the United States of America. Join me next time as we continue the story of the United States of America with the American Revolution.